First introduced with Photoshop CS, the shadow highlight command combines several useful techniques into one interface. By harnessing the shadow highlight command, you could fix both under and overexposed areas within an image. Let's see how we can harness this command to fix some troubled images. This image is a perfect subject for a shadow highlights adjustment. We have an area down here that is essentially devoid of any detail. It's completely in the shadows. And then we have an area by the sun that's relatively blown out. Let's choose Image, Adjustments, Shadow Highlight. Now, by default, just running the filter will accomplish some results, and Photoshop instantly assumes that since you chose the Shadow Highlight filter, you must have intended that the shadows were too dark, so it applies a default value of 50%. Now, these two sliders go a long way and allow you to adjust the shadow area and knock the highlights back down. However, you are a professional. Congratulations. Check the box that says Show More Options. Now, of course, the user interface just got a little bit scarier. But don't worry, this will make sense. Let's go ahead and hold down the Option or Alt key and click Reset. Right now, we'll start at the top and work our way to the bottom. The first area affects shadows, and currently the shadows are being lightened 50%. And it is being applied to about half of the image. In other words, the darkest 50% are classified as a shadow. Opening this up and making it a bigger number means a greater area will be affected. But if we only want to go after the darkest areas, we could say only the last darkest third is a shadow. So adjusting it will only affect the darkest areas. See how the grassy area, which is essentially lost, can be opened back up without really affecting the palm tree branches up above and making those look unnatural. Adjust the radius slider to go ahead and soften the selected area. Next, we'll go to highlights. And I want it to be a very narrow area. So if we lower this to say only the brightest 20% is a highlight. So now as we knock that down, notice how just part of the sun is being affected. If this were bigger, much more of the sky would be processed. So we'll leave that to a smaller number, so only a subtle change is happening in the sky region. The last area is adjustments to contrast and color. And normally, adjusting shadow highlight will take away some of the color. So Photoshop automatically puts a saturation adjustment of +20 back in. If you leave that at 0, you'll see that the image does look a little washed out. So your job is to find the right number, generally somewhere between 5 and 50, to get the color back in the image and match the way that you think the image should appear. Lastly, we have contrast, and we can put a little bit of contrast back in the midtones, and this can be useful if the shadow adjustment knocked away some of the contrast in the image. When satisfied, you can click OK. But first, let's toggle the original image and the adjusted image. And really, that's a pretty dramatic and effective adjustment. Let's click OK. I'm going to close this image and switch to one more problem image. Before I do, though, notice that the shadow highlight command is a destructive command. Close this. Not save. If you go to the Adjustment Layer menu, you'll see that Shadow Highlight is not an available adjustment layer. That's because it is a destructive adjustment that cannot be modified. However, Photoshop CS3 and the invention of smart filters provides a very interesting workaround. If I go ahead and right-click on this layer, I can convert it to a smart object. Smart objects allow for flexible editing of the image. In this case, we can apply the shadow highlight adjustment. And even though this is in the adjustment menu, it really is just a very complex filter that performs image adjustment techniques. So now the same dialog box comes up. We can isolate this to the shadows and say that the darkest 40% are shadows. Open them up a little bit. There we go. Actually, let's open that a little bit further. Soften it out. Knock the highlights, this bright area in the streets, down. Let's pull that down so that it's not as intense. There we go. That's better. And soften things a little. I'm going to go ahead and purposefully overcrank the color correction. And without looking, I clicked OK. And then I regained my better senses and realized that I really overdid it. Well, fortunately, in Photoshop CS3, you can now double-click on the shadow highlights here in the Filter Effect name area, and it will reopen, allowing you to back down that color correction to a more normal level and put a little contrast back in. There we go. And click OK. Now, just because you fix the shadow and the highlights doesn't mean that the image is done. This image still has some exposure and color problems, and it will benefit from a levels adjustment layer. We can be lazy and try auto, which did OK. Let's go ahead and reset. Or I can go through and make those individual channel adjustments, pulling this in to where that begins to rise on both ends. There we go. Balance the image in the middle. Go to the green channel. Pull this in to where the data begins to rise. And attempt to balance the histogram, treating this like a seesaw or teeter-totter. Put the 2 points on the end of the rise, and then balance it so it would be level. And let's go to the blue channel, and we'll do the same. Pull that in. There we go. And find the balance point. Way too blue. That looks better. Come back to the middle and just open that up a little bit more. Put a little bit of contrast into the blacks and click OK. Before, after. And that worked pretty well. Now, this image is grainy and it is not perfect. But if we go back to the original image, you'll see that those two commands essentially rescued an image that would have otherwise been absolutely unusable. So the shadow highlight command is very useful. And by combining that with Photoshop CS3's ability to apply it as a smart filter, you get the ability to further refine that effect by double-clicking on it. There we go. And let's put the levels adjustment back on. And there you have it, a fairly nice adjustment. To soften out this grain, I will go ahead in my image and choose Select All. And I will copy a merged copy and paste it. Let's put that at the very top of the stack. We can now apply a gentle Gaussian blur to soften this out a little bit. Let's do a value of about 9. There you go. Set this to a blending mode. Let's try soft light. And we'll back the opacity down. That worked pretty well. We could try overlay. And you'll see the difference. Before, after. Putting that blurred copy on top and adjusting its opacity and blending mode really just acts like a nice soft pro mist filter and removes a little bit of the grain and excessive detail. And there you have it. Combining the shadow highlight command with a few other tweaks like adjustment layers and blending modes to take an essentially unusable photo and make it much more usable for our purposes.